segment 4, the Cold War. Even under Mrs. Thatcher, Britain remains a power of the second rank. It's not a superpower, not a nation that can in any way conceivably set forward its military as a counterweight to the Soviet Union or its economy as a counterweight to the United States. And yet Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev and every right-minded historian of whom I'm aware recognizes that she played a central role in the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
Why is that recognition accorded to her? What?
I think because she knew when to hold them and when to fold them. And also to do with the alliance with Reagan, because essentially she and Reagan had analysed the situation correctly in the 70s when they were not yet in office, which was that Soviet power was becoming more and more threatening, and it had both political and military consequences, and the thing was in the balance. And she led the fight in Western Europe to install cruise and Pershing missiles to counter the Soviet nuclear missiles in the early 80s.
1983, the United States places missiles it deploys missiles in Britain and West Germany, and I think there were a small deployment in Italy as well, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And she takes an anti-nuclear demonstration in Hyde Park, as I recall, was to that point the largest public demonstration in British history.
Certainly very big. And but it had turned out in the 1983 election that the Labour belief in unilateral nuclear disarmament had helped them to lose very big. And she realised, simple point but important, that if you use the word unilateral, not many people know what it means, but if you say one-sided, they do know what it means. And she would say Labour wants one-sided disarmament. And this proved to be very, very effective for her. So once she'd carried this with the European allies, with her own electorate, she's in a very strong position to think, well, what happens next? We've pushed the Soviets back on this. What happens next?
I'd just like to play a clip from her eulogy that she recorded it about 18 months before President Reagan died, but it was played at his funeral. There are a couple of points about this that I'd like to ask you about, Charles.
Yes, he did not shrink from denouncing Moscow's evil empire, but he realized that a man of goodwill might nonetheless emerge from within its dark corridors. So the president resisted Soviet expansion and pressed down on Soviet weakness at every point until the day came when communism began to collapse beneath the combined weight of those pressures and its own failures. And when a man of goodwill did emerge from the ruins, President Reagan stepped forward to shake his hand and to offer sincere cooperation.
She met Gorbachev, still a junior member of the Politburo, about 3 months before the unexpected death of Chernenko and Gorbachev's elevation to General Secretary. Yeah. As I recall, they met at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. They were scheduled to meet for about an hour. It ran 5 hours, and she made a point of saying publicly soon thereafter, I like Mr. Gorbachev, we can do business together. Yeah. And here in this eulogy, she calls him a man of goodwill. Yeah. Now, what's so striking about the event as it takes place in 1985, I like Mr. Gorbachev, and this eulogy, a man of goodwill, here we have Margaret Thatcher, the unreconstructed, unrepentant, anti-communist, cold warrior par excellence, and she sees Gorbachev and changes her thinking, or at least recognizes something. In other words, you get a remarkable intellectual agility, no?
I think that's correct. She never thought that Soviet communism had anything good about it, but she detected in Gorbachev a readiness to recognize reality. And she thought that conversation you mentioned at Chequers was vital, because if you read, you can't yet do so, but people will eventually be able to read the conversation, and the tremendous argument they have with one another, where they're very, very frank and each attacks the other's system and so on. But this actually builds up a basis of trust. Nobody's conceding points of principle, but they enjoy the talk and it's very frank and clear. And they then see that there are actually things that they can think about together. And so some sort of human rapport is established, and some idea that, we don't have to be threatening one another all the time. And from that, Mrs. Thatcher thought, right, we can move. She had the confidence that the Western system would ultimately prevail, both economically and militarily and politically. And that confidence pushed her forward to think, well, you can also negotiate. And so off she went to President Reagan that very week, flew via Peking and Hong Kong and Pearl Harbor. She dropped in on the way, in the middle of the night, by the way, to Washington, saw President Reagan to talk about this, to tell him, because the Reagan administration needed some persuading on this matter, and a lot of people who admired Mrs. Thatcher in the administration did not agree with her about this, that this was worth pursuing.
Once she got to him, Reagan did. Yes.
Yeah, and of course that was the key thing that Reagan did. And what she was trying to do all the time was to keep the alliance together, prevent Gorbachev from driving a wedge between Western allies, but help move President Reagan on. And so when in that tribute she was talking about Gorbachev as a man of goodwill, that's a good phrase, because she wasn't saying he was right about anything, but she was saying that he had the necessary will. You could have the conversation with him.
Right. Charles, let me ask about one. This is frustrating because even if it's a web and we can talk, I'd love to have a 5-hour conversation with you. I like Mr. Moore. We can do business together. But let me ask about one aspect of her relationship with Ronald Reagan. And this is to me, it's so fascinating because it's a disagreement, and there's policy, and it was questions of analysis, but also the friendship, all bound up in this. Reagan, Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. Now, she doesn't like it. And in fact, I can't remember the year, 84 perhaps, she flies to Camp David. It hammers out this agreement, 4 points, which was...
Yes, this was the same occasion as she saw him about Gorbachev.
Yes, yes. And one of the 4 points was that the Strategic Defense Initiative would be used to enhance deterrence rather than undermine it. Yeah. And as best I read the situation, President Reagan just said, well, whatever her form of words will please her, let her have it. But she wanted to tie the Strategic Defense Initiative into the status quo, which wasn't the game he was playing at all. No. He wanted to overturn the status quo. Reykjavik, 1986, Reagan almost agrees to Gorbachev's sweeping proposals to reduce nuclear weapons, and walks out in the end because Gorbachev says you must limit SDI to research only, no deployment. Mrs. Thatcher, in her autobiography on Reykjavik, it was like an earthquake. There was no place where you could put your political feet. And yet, later she writes that the decision to pursue the Strategic Defense Initiative was the most far-reaching and consequential of Reagan's administration. Put all that together for me, will you?
Well, I think it can be done. I mean, she was very shocked, not by SDI, but by Reagan's belief that you could just do away with nuclear weapons. She did not agree with him about that. She thought that nuclear weapons were the best guarantee of peace in a wicked world because of the deterrent effect. And whenever he said, let's get rid of the whole lot, this really frightened her. She was worried about SDI for similar reasons, because she thought this was a utopian idea about how you could supersede all existing. Right. But she also could see its great political utility and its capacity to make the Russians feel they couldn't keep up. So when she was doing all this stuff about you can have the research but not the deployment, what she was trying to do was to get a line which all the allies could agree on, so that there wouldn't be a terrible bust-up between the other allies and the United States. She was very happy that Reagan pushed SDI forward, not as an actual reality of exactly what you're going to do, but as a sort of concept that would terrify the Russians.